It was meant to be Joe Biden's big day, his farewell to the Democrats, but then this happened. There's Kamala Harris proving that she's actually the big noise at the Democratic convention in Chicago, breaking with tradition and appearing before her big speech on Thursday. We'll be joined by Tony Diver, our US editor, to answer the big question. Can she beat Donald Trump?
We'll also be discussing working from home after Downing Street suggested that plans for a new right to switch off could mean that staff have to spend less time in the office. Is this a disaster for everyone, or is it the answer to the future of work?
And Camilla, we don't work from home because welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Turner.
This week in America, Camilla, has been dominated by the Democrat National Convention, their big party event, a bit like the party conferences here in the United Kingdom, whether that's Labour or the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats, a moment to showcase your party to the country. And of course, given that we're only a matter of months away from the presidential election, a really vital moment. Has Harris got the big mo, that really important momentum going into that election? And as we said, can she beat Trump?
And it's crazy to think about it, really, because just 7 weeks ago, this looked like it was going to be a contest between two old men. And now it's going to be a race between one old man, Donald Trump, and Kamala Harris, who could potentially be the first female president of America. Let's take a look back at some of the most significant moments of those past 7 weeks. And let's start with that moment when Biden still thought he was going to be president, even following the disastrous debate with Trump.
Folks, I don't walk as easy as I used to. I don't speak as smoothly as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to. I know how to get things done. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
Well, sadly, Joe Biden didn't get back up, and it was only a few days after that, or a couple of weeks after that, that he actually stepped down under a lot of pressure from the Democratic Party itself. And he made it quite clear at that moment that that wasn't necessarily his choice.
You know, in recent weeks, it's become clear to me that I need to unite my party in this critical endeavor. I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy.
A very different tone in his voice there.
Amazing, isn't it, to hear that back, Camilla? Really remarkable.
And then no sooner was Kamala Harris on the scene as the next Democratic candidate, did she sort of take off on social media, and really with social media doing a lot of the heavy lifting of her campaign in those early days, with memes starting to spread all over the place.
The skill of that campaign, Camilla, was that things which had been used to attack her, that coconut tree comment was a rather bizarre part of a speech she had made, but actually it was then used to her advantage. She does appear to have some very, very clever advisors who realise that you actually use what your opponent is attacking you for to actually make yourself look cool and good, particularly to young voters. Donald Trump has then really struggled to how do you pivot from fighting an 80-plus-year-old candidate for the president, older than you, Joe Biden, to Kamala Harris, a far younger next generation candidate.
One example of that was just over the weekend with Trump launching a critique of Kamala Harris at his rally in Pennsylvania, picking up on her laugh in particular.
Look, people say, be nice. Have you heard her laugh? That is the laugh of a crazy person. That is the laugh of a crazy. It's the laugh of a lunatic.
So that's a bit of the history. What a remarkable 7 weeks, Camilla, as you said. And now we've got our US editor, Tony Diver. No stranger to the podcast. Tony, welcome from Chicago. Thanks for joining us. Let's kick off straight away. You obviously were at the Republican conference just a few weeks ago. You're now at the Democrat conference in Chicago. How different, or is the mood different?
Well, Kamal, there's a very positive mood here, I think it's fair to say, from all the delegates who've come from different states to see through the formal process of nominating Kamala Harris as the party's nominee. Now, you remember when we spoke before at the Republican convention, it was just after that assassination attempt against Donald Trump, and there was a sense of kind of fight back among the party, this sense of taking on these dark external forces that were tackling Trump. But there was still, no doubt that it was going to be a very difficult race. Here, there is a feeling that the party has got over the trials and tribulations of Joe Biden's age, which was the big dark cloud hanging over this party. And they've now moved forward. They've got a candidate. Looking at the national polls, Kamala Harris is up by a couple of points against Donald Trump. And in the swing states where it really matters, she's gaining ground in places where the Biden campaign thought they would never be able to beat Trump before he stood down. So there is a sense of celebration and jubilation here at this convention. There's also a slight sense of trepidation, I would say, given that, they're running such a short campaign, that Kamala Harris has only been in place for a few weeks, and yet they've still only got a few weeks to run until November's election. So they've got a long way to go, and they've still got a lot of convincing of voters of their core messages, those that are different, certainly, to Joe Biden's. But I think there's a very positive mood here, and certainly Democrats are feeling more optimistic than they were a few weeks ago when Joe Biden was still their man.
And how did Joe Biden's speech go down with those at the conference? What was it like on the floor? What was the atmosphere? Did it come across as lackluster at all, or were people sort of genuinely pleased to hear from him?
I think people seem very emotional, actually. I mean, what we got from Biden last night was this kind of valedictory speech in which he tried to define his legacy as a president, which he passed the torch on to Kamala Harris, who, of course, he chose to be his running mate back in 2020. And Biden himself was very emotional. He shed a tear with his daughter Ashley, who introduced him as he came onto the stage. And he really took the long view on his whole 50-year career in US politics and on the 3.5 years that he's been in the White House. So, I think probably had Biden still been the nominee, there would have been a lot of grumbling from Democrats. He would have said that it was a fairly woolly speech, that he didn't go that hard in attacking Donald Trump. And there were a couple of moments in that us journalists would have been looking for as examples of gaffes. But he gets a free pass now. He's not the nominee. He's made the decision to step down. And I think there was a lot of gratitude in the room, it felt to me, to Biden, the man who won in the last election and has now potentially given them the chance of winning the next.
Quite unusual, Tony, that Kamala Harris decided to actually appear overnight at the convention. Usually the tradition is that she waits until her big speech day, which is coming on Thursday. So Kamala Harris slightly steals some of the headlines by coming on to, pumping Beyonce. Second point as well, Biden spoke so late that he was out of prime time. Is there any evidence, do you feel, that they're slightly suppressing Biden because they don't want to remind voters too many times, golly, it wasn't that long ago that you were offering this bloke to be the next president of the United States?
Well, on your first point, I think that's another of the major differences that we had with the Republican convention. Donald Trump was kept completely under wraps for the first couple of nights during the Republican convention, and then he sat watching, said absolutely nothing right until the very end at that event, whereas Kamala Harris came straight out. She welcomed everyone. She thanked Biden. And I would say that brought some energy to the opening day of the convention, which otherwise can be a little bit flat. On your second point, though, it was curious that Biden didn't turn up until much later than he'd been billed to. At one point, it looked as if the schedule was running about 90 minutes late, which would have meant for those on the East Coast, which is generally how these things are calculated, people in New York and Washington, he wouldn't have been on TV until well after 11:30, which, of course, is the time when many people are already in bed, so they wouldn't have been able to watch him on TV. I suspect it's more a case of poor organisation and other speeches running on too long, and an unwillingness to cut some of those speeches down because, of course, there's a lot of big egos going on at conventions like this, and other politicians who were speaking before Biden would have been very unhappy to hear that they didn't have as much time on the stage. But I think it's probably more that than it is a deliberate attempt by Democrats to push Biden back. But again, you can probably see that as just a sign of how much things have changed. I mean, can you imagine a situation in which the president's speech would have been delayed by other people by over an hour just a few weeks ago? Absolutely not. Now, he's not the man that everyone's here to see.
And there is a view that the best thing Biden could do in the interests of the Democrats and in the interests of the Democrats winning the next election is just to step aside and let Kamala Harris essentially become president now, so people can see her looking presidential and hear from her more, and that would kind of really help with her profile. First of all, maybe a stupid question, but is that even possible? And also, even if she does just stay on in her current role as vice president, do you think we'll see and hear more of her in the next few months alongside running her campaign, just in that role? Because if the view is the more people see of her and hear of her, the more they like her, the more they can get used to the idea of her potentially being the next president.
But the fact is, Tony, just to add to that, Camilla, the fact is she hasn't done an interview yet. I think she's plotted now with what might be described as the mainstream media. Her speech, obviously, is on Thursday. I think she's got one interview plotted in before the end of August. She hasn't held a press conference. So there's this odd contradiction between there's not long to go, people need to understand her better, alongside she's actually holding back quite a lot, maybe some might say, because the momentum is already there in social media and what people are saying about Kamala Harris that doesn't need Kamala Harris to lean in and be more present.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's definitely a sense that Kamala Harris is being hidden away a bit by her campaign. And I wonder if that's because there's some kind of leftover nervousness about the way that Joe Biden's interviews played out during the early stages of this campaign. Every single time he did an interview, it seemed to go wrong in one way or another. And I wonder whether or not some of the people working on the campaign, who are largely speaking the same people who are working on the Biden campaign, are still a bit nervous about putting her in front of the cameras. On your point about her taking over as president, yes, it's theoretically possible for him to resign the presidency and for her to take over. But the only people who are calling for that at the moment are Donald Trump and the Republicans, which I think perhaps gives you a fairly good idea of why they don't want to do it. They don't want to tie her up in the day-to-day business of governing. Of course, there's still these major policy areas that Biden is focusing on every day, not least the war in Gaza and the ceasefire that his administration is attempting to negotiate at the moment. They don't want to tie Kamala Harris up in that. They want her to be able to focus on the campaign. And they also want her to be able to present her own message in this presidential election and not have to carry the can for anything that went wrong during the Biden administration. So I think putting her into the White House right now would allow her to do basically nothing in terms of new policy and change of direction and anything else that she would like to do from a government point of view. But it would also tie her very much to the administration. It would give her less time to be out campaigning. And it would probably be to the benefit of Donald Trump and the Republicans, which I think is exactly why they won't do it.
And on that point about, we were just discussing how we haven't seen or heard from her a huge amount so far. She hasn't done many interviews, etc. I mean, there's also a view people talk about here that she's borrowing from the Keir Starmer playbook, the so-called Ming Vase strategy, where you just say and give away as little as possible so that you don't need to tie your hands, and also so that you perhaps only reveal your kind of true policy areas once it's too late, once you're already in power. I mean, is that anything people talk about over there?
Yes, I haven't heard any direct comparisons to Keir Starmer, but that is exactly the theme
never heard of
the
it,
analysis. Yeah, I don't think he is the lodestar for US politicians in presidential elections. But yes, that same analysis is being applied to Kamala Harris over here, and she has given some policy direction. I mean, she gave a major speech on the economy last week in which she set out a federal ban that she would put on price gouging to try and bring down the price of groceries. She has revealed a little bit of her tax plans, but no, largely speaking, she's campaigning on the messaging and the rhetoric of her campaign. She's talking about those issues which are bringing moderate voters over to the Democrats, which include abortion, and she's not getting too much into the policy weeds. So that is probably another reason why she's avoiding doing these interviews. I think there is a bit of nervousness from Democrats that I've spoken to about that strategy because, of course, when Keir Starmer was doing it, he was 25 points ahead in the polls. And she is neck and neck in a lot of these states. And certainly in Pennsylvania, which is turning out to be the closest swing state in this race. Alternate polls put her ahead and then Trump ahead. So there is a sense that she perhaps shouldn't be holding anything back in the campaign at this point, especially given that it got off the ground so late compared to Trump's. At this point, the campaign really should be going for it. But I can understand the nervousness, especially given what happened with Biden and the way that media interviews ultimately played out for his campaign.
I think it's really interesting, that analysis, Tony, that the Democrats are nervous of them being tested in an interview space. Just to lean into that point you've just made about a federal ban on grocery price rises, put them in front of any semi-competent, economically literate interviewer, and that person will be able to take that policy apart. Federal governments imposing price controls on food is a recipe for disaster. The Democrats have also said they're going to raise corporation tax really significantly. Kamala Harris has said that. I think beyond the speech, Tony, I think the Democrats at the weekend produced this 92-page, almost like a manifesto, which they kind of spoke about some of these areas. And I think under testing, I think Harris would struggle to sound convincing. And so it's like this is a vibes election. She's got good vibes, and she's the 59-year-old woman of color, could be the first female president of the United States, against an old man who deals in insults, has all the problems that we know around the way he behaves. And it's almost like they hope that's going to create enough momentum to get them to Election Day.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. I mean, I think to be fair to Harris, the man who has brought vibes-based politics to the United States since 2016 is Trump rather than the Democrats.
Yeah.
And perhaps this is an example of her playing him his own game. But yes, you're right. There is, from economic commentators, there is a lot of skepticism of this price gouging policy. It hasn't been fully explained. We don't know exactly how the federal government would go about banning companies from putting up grocery prices, or indeed punishing them for doing it. Republicans, of course, say this is a completely unacceptable intervention in the free market, and they don't believe that these predatory grocery companies are trying to squeeze American consumers, but that actually there are supply chain issues, and that's why inflation has been so high for the last couple of years. But from a vibes point of view, to use your phrase, the economy is always the number one issue that voters care about the most, and especially inflation. And some strategists that I've spoken to have said the problem with the Biden campaign was that he talked about the economy in these big macroeconomic terms. He talked about foreign investment, he talked about the headline rate of unemployment, he talked about inflation, but he did it in a very Washington way, which didn't actually translate into the way that voters think about their daily lives. And that, frankly, is the price of groceries, the price of petrol, and the other pressures that are on the household pocketbook. And so this policy is an attempt by Kamala Harris to try and translate some of the power of the federal government and the levers that she would have on offer to her in the White House into a policy where she can say, oh yeah, look, your cereal, your milk, your eggs, your bread, that's all going to be less expensive under my administration. Whether or not that policy would work is slightly beside the point as far as the campaign is concerned. I think this is all about messaging, and as you say, perhaps it's really about vibes.
And given what we have heard from Kamala Harris about some of her policies so far, this grocery one among others, how is the Trump campaign responding to that? Is there anything they've kind of latched onto to attack her over, or are there any particular points they're trying to land with potential swing voters?
Yeah, well, this is one of the big debates, Camilla, is about how Trump should respond to this. I mean, his reaction has been somewhat characteristic. He's gone after her personally. He calls her Comrade Kamala. He says that she's a communist. He's made some pretty unsavory remarks about her ethnicity and her family background. He's talked a lot about her hair and the way that she looks, and he's run basically a kind of personal campaign against Kamala Harris. There's a lot of Republicans who think that's a mistake, and what he should actually be focusing on is policy. And on the policy front, there is a lot of stuff that he could be attacking her over very strongly, not least the situation on the southern US border, which is a major concern for US voters, as it is for voters in the UK. I think there's a lot of similarities between the debates on legal migration here and back at home. And Kamala Harris had a pretty pivotal role in the Biden border strategy, which has led to record illegal migration and people coming over the southern border across the Rio Grande into those southern states. So that's one of the issues that a lot of Republicans feel he should be focusing on more. And again, looking at her record in California, she's a former district attorney in the state of California. California is a state which has some pretty serious crime problems. I mean, you only have to go to San Francisco or look at pictures of San Francisco and what it's like now compared to how it was 5 or 10 years ago, and you will see that there's the strategy of Democrats and liberals in California in dealing with crime has not been hugely successful. So yeah, Trump's current strategy is to use the standard Trump playbook, talk about Kamala in derogatory terms, and hope that that characterization of her carries with voters. But there's plenty of other policy stuff as well, and I think given the kinds of voices we've heard in the Republican Party pushing him to focus on those instead, we're likely to see a lot more of that in the future.
Do you think he actually listens, Tony? I sometimes feel, and I don't mean this at all in a derogatory way, sort of telling Trump to change the way he presents himself is like trying to teach a dog Spanish. I mean, it's just not a thing that is possible. And does Donald Trump actually listen to advisors and think, yes, I need to land these messages? Whenever he gives a speech, he's on the script of the speech for about 10% of the speech. And then he starts talking about Hannibal Lecter, and he starts talking about when he plays golf, and he starts talking about things which are actually quite difficult to follow. And the Democrats have reversed the attack that was used against them when they had Biden as their presidential candidate to attack Trump, in that Trump makes no sense. And they've got this huge social media campaign about Weird Trump, which is obviously getting some traction amongst at least some voters in the US. I mean, does Trump have the ability to focus on this idea of messaging, or is that exactly what he thinks is the problem, this kind of Washingtonian messaging, as you've said, Tony, that Biden sometimes used, that the public don't want that? They want me riffing. They want me being this kind of, vibes guy, and I'm going to keep doing that. And everyone told me it would never work in 2016, and it did. I got the second highest ever presidential vote in 2020, only beaten by the person who got the highest presidential vote, Biden. So I know this stuff, guys. Don't tell me what to do.
Well, yeah, put it this way. Has there been one advisor behind Donald Trump who has masterminded his rise all the way from a businessman to being a president and possibly a president for a second term? No, there isn't. The man doing all of that is Donald Trump. And so what we've actually seen in the last few days is Trump's debate with his advisors about the way that he should be carrying himself playing out publicly, because when he gets asked in interviews, do you think these people are right? Do people like Vivek Ramaswamy, Kellyanne Conway, these kind of big Republican figures who are telling you to stop attacking her personally, are you going to do that? Trump says, well, why shouldn't I? I'm angry with her. I think her policy ideas are bad. I think she's ruined the country under the Biden administration, and I think we should be pointing that out. So, yeah, I mean, how do you, as a strategist who's worked in conventional mainstream politics, try and bottle the Trump charm, try and explain why exactly it is that voters love the way that he presents himself in these rallies with these long rambling stories? Well, you can't do that. So a lot of these people are, trying to force Trump to fit into a more conventional political mold. That said, they've got polling which does say that him launching these personal attacks against her doesn't poll that well. It may play very well to his base, these highly motivated people who are going to the rallies, who are watching him, who love him as a man. But this election isn't about those people. This election is about the moderate voters, potentially the Nikki Haley voters from the Republican primary, possibly some disaffected Democrats. Those are the people that are going to win in the swing states. And the feeling is perhaps that these kind of personal attacks is not the way to get those people on side.
And thinking about those crucial voters in the swing states, what do you see as the biggest challenge for Kamala Harris, or challenges, and what do you see as her potential biggest weaknesses in her ability to win over these voters?
Well, there's a few issues that she's got. One of them is that a lot of Democrat voters are very skeptical of the Biden administration's support for Israel. And that in some states, including Michigan and Pennsylvania, two of the key swing states, there is a high population of Muslims who generally would be considered Democrats, who are feeling very skeptical about voting for her this time round because they feel that Biden has been too close to Benjamin Netanyahu, and that Kamala Harris as part of the administration is to some extent on side with him there. There has been an attempt by the Harris campaign to change the way that she's perceived vis-a-vis Israel, and her not turning up to Benjamin Netanyahu's address to Congress last month is a good example of how they've tried to do that. But there is a bit of a risk there that some of those voters either don't vote or turn to a third-party candidate who is more pro-Palestine, someone like Cornel West, who is a slight fringe figure, but someone who has basically built his presidential campaign around this kind of progressive international issue. So I think that's one of the big issues that she's facing. She's doing better among other demographic groups. She's doing very well with black voters. She's doing better with Latino voters, although still not as high as you would expect for a Democrat during a presidential election. And she's a lot more popular with women than Biden was. So there are some demographic groups, and of course, American pollsters and strategists always talk about their politics in this slightly strange way to us, where they divide the whole country up by demographics and then decide who's going to vote for who. But if you were to do that, you would find that Harris is doing a lot better among some of those groups. One of the other big risks for her, I suppose, is these moderates who I was just talking about, and particularly people who live in Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, who likes Joe Biden because he had this union background. He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He lived in Delaware. He always talks about unions and the middle class and building up those labor relations. Well, she doesn't have that kind of heritage, and she's relying on other people in her team and her vice president to try and help her with that message. So there's a potential risk there, given that some of those voters historically have been people that have gone over to Trump. But on the whole, it does seem that the campaign is working a lot better than the Biden campaign was doing just a few weeks ago.
She'll probably have to rely a little, as you say, Tony, on Tim Walz for that type of her vice president pick, to have that slightly more Rust Belt tone to him and talking to the workers, etc. Just finally then, Tony, you've been with us since the launch of this podcast, and we've asked you each time to which way are you leaning? Which way is the Tony barometer on who may win? I think we started off with leaning Trump. I think we got a bit stronger Trump with the Biden crisis. Which way are you leaning now to the direct question, can Kamala Harris beat Trump in November?
Well, I hate making these kind of predictions, although you always ask me to. But
yeah, I can only apologise.
Can she do it? Does she have a route to 270 electoral college votes via the swing states? Absolutely. That path definitely exists. And at the moment, it seems that looking at swing state and national polling, she's better placed to do that than Trump is. So yes, the answer to that is yes. However, as we've seen over the last few weeks, a lot of this stuff can change very, very quickly. And we can see candidates going up 5 or 10 points in the polls or down 5 or 10 points in the polls extremely quickly. So my prediction at the moment would be, if everything stays as it is, which it won't, then Kamala Harris will win this election. But everything can change, and there's still a long way to go.
Thanks so much for your time, Tony. We really appreciate you joining us today. And now we're going to be discussing working from home, after Downing Street warned that a culture of presenteeism is bad for productivity. Now, this comes in the context of a real change in tone as regards working from home from this administration to the last. We've got Angela Rayner's new workers' rights reforms that include things like the right to switch off, potentially emailing people outside of office hours, being frowned upon, all these sorts of ideas, really leaning into this new working from home culture that we've seen so much of since the pandemic. What do you think about this, Kamal, and what actually is the evidence?
I'm going to be super honest. As an older person, the whole idea of working from home immediately makes me resile and think it's a manifesto for laziness, for people doing their domestic admin during working hours. It must be wrong. How can people work like that? But if you look at the evidence and the modern way of working, and you think about people's work-life balance, we have to change in some types of employment. Firstly, you've got to be clear, not everyone can work from home. This can sometimes feel like a little bit of a middle-class discussion, which we have to be careful of. But if you think about the way my generation first started working in the 90s, where 12, 14-hour days. You sacrifice everything for work. And the famous quote, almost nobody on their deathbed says, the one thing I wish I'd done more of was working. It's all the things you miss because of it. And there needs to be a fundamental change to support people who have got parenting responsibilities, a fundamental change to support people who maybe the commute is difficult or they're disabled, or there could be all sorts of different reasons that just building workplaces for people who can commute for a certain amount of time, work very, very hard for 12 hours on the trot and then go home. There must be a more modern way to look at it. So to tackle this working from home issue, as you say, Camilla, what's the evidence? And we asked Jess Hopkins, one of our production team, and she looked through the studies. I'm just going to go through a few of the points. So a Stanford study from the US suggests that working from home improves retention. So people, staying at work, not quitting to go and do something else without damaging performance. And then one that Jess found, and also I looked at, was this. They did a big study, and it was published in Nature about a month ago. Trip.com, it's a big travel business. They interviewed 1,600 workers, and they then had a group that didn't work from home, and they tested them against a group that did work from home. And they did find that hybrid working, so that's that mix. We're not really talking here, are we, Camilla, of people who just work from home. It's sort of this hybrid. You're in work 3 days a week, you're maybe at home 2 days a week. Did find that hybrid working improved job satisfaction and reduced the rate at which people left, that retention issue again, by 1/3, and didn't seem to negatively affect employees' performance. And managers who would come in maybe with my type of attitude, this must be a bad thing, actually, when they looked at the evidence, realised that it wasn't appalling. But I think, Camilla, we were talking about this before we came up to the studio. I think you are more sceptical maybe than I am, given even where some of the evidence is.
I don't dispute any of that evidence that you've just cited, and I'm sure there'll be more and more studies to come on this phenomenon, just because it's taken on such a life of its own since the pandemic and changing working patterns and so on. But I do think there are some things that perhaps aren't encapsulated by these sorts of surveys. For example, the fact that as a more junior employee, you might really benefit from the experience and expertise of working alongside and being close to, hearing and having conversations with those more senior colleagues. If you're stuck at home in a sort of house share on a desk in the corner of your bedroom on your own all day as a more junior staff member, you're just not experiencing that kind of workplace culture and environment and those kind of chance conversations you might have with someone that might give you a great idea for a new project. Those kind of things are harder to get from these kind of studies. But I do think that kind of workplace culture and environment is really valuable, particularly for these entry-level career people.
It has become a dividing line, which I think for me seems not the best way to discuss what has been a major shift, and probably a more positive shift towards a more flexible way of working. You remember Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think, was it when he was business secretary, or certainly, I can't quite remember what ministerial role he had, but when he was still in government, he used to stalk around civil service departments in government and leave a note on the desk, slightly passive-aggressive note saying, "Sorry you were out when I visited. I look forward to seeing you in the office very soon. With every good wish, the Right Honourable Jacob Rees-Mogg, MP." And it was on crested notepaper. So with every good wish has got a whiff of menace. And I think if there's any piece of advice I would give to the Conservative side of this debate, is that it doesn't need to be a political war. You can just have a discussion, sort of business by business and department by department. What is the best way to get the most out of our employees?
Well, I think you're right. Jacob Rees-Mogg really became the champion of the anti-working from home brigade while he was in government. I think he instigated publishing league tables to show every single Whitehall department how many people are at their desk, how many aren't. It'll be very interesting to see if this government continue with those league tables, given, as we said, the kind of change on stance that they have towards working from home. I remember from well, and even now, every time I go to interview a Secretary of State in the department on a Friday, doing my interviews for the Sunday Telegraph, the department is completely empty. No matter what department it is, all 10 floors, I go up in the lift and I can see it. Not a single person. The only person at work is the Secretary of State themselves and maybe their close advisors, and that's it.
And do you think, does that seem to you to be, that must be a bad thing? Because people have got laptops. The civil service is, in many, many areas, particularly in London, a relatively middle class and older cohort of workers, and they are the ones that find working from home the simplest and maybe that has the least negative impact on what they work on. But do you think just seeing acres of empty floors just makes you feel negative?
Well, I suppose it's that feeling that there are certain parts of Whitehall that aren't and haven't for a long time been working very well. When people are struggling to, for example, all the issues we have with the passport office or troubles with driving licenses, different elements of the bureaucratic state not really working. And then on top of that, this idea that, oh, no one's bothering to come to the office every day because they're all just working at home and maybe doing their shopping, hanging up a wash. I just don't think that fills the public with much confidence.
You were saying, Camilla, in our chat earlier, that your visit to the supermarket on a Monday, which is actually a well-earned day off for you, given that you are, as the Sunday Telegraph's political editor, working on Saturday and a very, very long shift on Saturday, as well as all the other days of the week. What was your experience of going into your local supermarket?
Yeah, so on a Monday, when I'm doing my shopping on my day off, it's absolutely jam-packed. There are more people in my local supermarket
Laggards.
on a Monday. The queue goes round all the way, snakes all the way around the shop. So many more people than there are on a weekend. And I think that's because all these people are working from home on a Monday and taking the time to do their leisurely grocery shop.
But they might have saved some time by not commuting. I'm sure it's actually as well probably good for the environment. Given a bit of advice to the Conservatives, which obviously they won't listen to, a little bit of advice to Labour, which they probably won't listen to either, is directives to businesses, I think, is a harder area, and that Labour need to be really careful that they don't think that they can tell businesses how it is they should treat their staff, the opportunities they should give them. It should be up to businesses to understand the correct mix, because it is impossible from Whitehall to understand, as you say, that serendipitous meeting, which actually leads to a very good idea. I was saying to you yesterday, just walking around the Telegraph newsroom, I bumped into 3 colleagues and we all had quick conversations about ideas, which will all come to fruition. That would never have happened on a Zoom call. It would have never have happened if I'd scheduled a meeting. Because you know that when you schedule a meeting, you then get ready for that meeting and nothing else. You're not actually there just to have a conversation. So the watch, I think, for the Conservatives is, are they going to maintain this idea of it being a divisive issue, wokery gone mad, we're going towards a socialist state if everyone could work from home, which might be to slightly paraphrase Jacob Rees-Mogg, but possibly some truth in that. But also on the Labour side, authoritarianism, Whitehall telling business what to do, which I think will have exactly the opposite effect on productivity than the one they may hope.
That's right. And I think this workers' charter that Angela Rayner's drawing up has already rubbed some small businesses up the wrong way, because we've heard from the sort of representative bodies of small business owners, they don't like to have too much red tape. They don't like to be told what to do too much. This idea of not being able to email anyone out of hours, and that could land you in hot water. As a small business, you might just need a bit of freedom to run your business and for your staff to kind of be slightly flexible, perhaps. You might not want these edicts coming down from Whitehall telling you exactly what you can and can't do, because allowing that flexibility is perhaps how your business will flourish and will grow. So I think there will be a bit of friction here when Labour try to go too far in the direction of enshrining workers' rights, but is that maybe at the cost of businesses being able to flourish and grow?
Well, Camilla, we've had the comments from Downing Street, but what's actually going to happen next?
Well, next up, we've got this employment bill, which Labour have promised to bring in within the first 100 days of their government. So that will bring us up to sometime in autumn. And until then, I think this debate will just continue, really, the rights of workers versus businesses being able to do and say as much as they can with as much freedom as possible.
Now, I'm sure you have lots of opinions on working from home, maybe good, maybe bad. Do get in touch with us, thedailytea@telegraph.co.uk. We do love hearing from you and read all your and read everything you send us. You can also comment on our socials, X, Instagram and TikTok @Daily Tea Podcast. We will not be working from home tomorrow or any other day because our studio isn't our house, thank goodness. But do join us again. Camilla, thank you so much for today's Daily Tea. Back again tomorrow, 5 o'clock.